Dear colleague, dear friends, we have a very special guest today, Dominican Professor William Warren, Chair of Catholic Studies, University of Tulsa. You can read Medieval Jews and the Dominican Order is the topic of this afternoon. I think it will be very new for us. Maybe this is a new era for us, because this is not directly deals with the Holocaust, but maybe our knowledge became bigger and better after this lecture. So, Professor Trudlo, the floor is yours. Enjoy.
I'm very grateful to Tamas and to Zoltan and to Attila for this opportunity to be able to speak with you today. I'm also grateful to Dr. Russell Lemons. The Fulbright program, along with events like this, help to bring scholars together as representatives of the closeness of our countries, particularly during such unfortunate events. Yet the holiday celebrated tonight is also a celebration of endurance through difficult times. So I wish you all a very happy Purim. I hope that all of you at some point during the festival have celebrated with drink to the point that you are unable to distinguish between Arur Haman and Baruch Mordecai. That stipulation comes from the Babylonian Talmud, which will be a topic in tonight's talk. But I want to begin our discussion with something more local. In the early 1220s, Saint Dominic of Caleruega dispatched one of his first disciples on a missionary trip to Hungary to minister among the newly settled tribe known as the Cumans, Kunok. This disciple, known to history as St. Paul of Hungary, was the first Dominican missionary in history, and a somewhat surprising choice. Paul was the author of one of the first academic works in the order's illustrious history, a manual for priests who were hearing people's confessions of sin. In his life, then, he brings together two of the characteristics that made his order famous: an orientation to practical or pastoral theology, involving such things as counseling, spiritual direction, and confession, and an active approach to ministry, one quite different from the monastic orders of the past. With him, Paul brought the order of friars preachers, popularly known as the Dominicans, making Hungary one of the first bases of the dynamic young order. By the mid-13th century, the Dominicans had grown in influence, and one of their masters general, Johannes Theotonicus, became a bishop and close advisor of King Bela IV. This influence was underscored by the heroic example of his daughter, Saint Margaret. Indeed, so distinguished was the Hungarian province that the first general chapter of the order to be held outside of France or Italy was held in Buda in 1256, which confirmed the mastership of Humbert of Romans, who in many ways was the second founder. I mention these facts not only to underscore the place of Dominicans in the formative history of Hungary, but also to underline my own particular expertise as a church historian and historical theologian. I primarily study the saints and thinkers of the first century of Dominican history, roughly from their foundation in 1216 to the canonization of Thomas Aquinas in 1323. The purpose of this order was to create a corps of intellectually elite preachers, formed with academic rigor, to minister to the pastoral needs of the Christian people. In this, they shared a mission with their contemporary Franciscans, yet, unlike them, they were clerical and focused on education from the very beginning. Their organization was established by Dominic's constitution, a brilliant blend of democracy and aristocracy that has proven so enduring it has not undergone substantial revision in 800 years. Within a generation, some of the most famous thinkers of the 13th century had joined the Dominican order and fixed it along the two intellectual poles of Christian Europe, the universities of Bologna and Paris. The order began to turn out brilliant preachers, intellectuals, and lawyers, men who quickly proved their worth to the Roman See. The papacy and the Dominicans formed a symbiotic relationship whereby the friars would expand using exceptional papal privileges, and in turn would establish an elite cadre of men dedicated to the Roman Church in every city in Christendom. It was to be a mightily profitable association. Though my studies focus on the order and its saints and thinkers, it is impossible to avoid the vexed question of the relation of the friars to the Jews. Indeed, some climactic episodes of medieval Jewish history crossed paths with the friars' preachers, a fact that has generated an enormous amount of scholarship. In this afternoon's lecture, I want to look more closely at three main strands. The first is the discovery and assimilation of the thought of Rabbi Moses ben Maimon in the Latin West, better known to them as Maimonides. In the second place, I want to look at the sometimes explosive interaction between Jewish theological works and the Dominican order. This will involve an assessment of the Inquisitions of the medieval period and their sometimes ambiguous relationship to the Jewish people. Finally, I want to survey how the main thinkers among the friars understood issues of Jewish-Christian relations, with a particular focus on Thomas Aquinas. I want to stress that my expertise lies on the Dominican side of this equation, which makes the time that I spend with you so valuable to me. I am most curious and would be most grateful for any interventions you could make from the Jewish perspective as regards these topics. Before touching on any of these particular points, I would like to set the scholarly stage, as it were. In many ways, the historiography of the Dominican order and of their relations with the Jews has been interpreted in what scholar Robin Vos calls a maximalist sense. This means that each interaction between the two sometimes takes on an exaggerated meaning that is expected to bear interpretations that often go beyond our evidence. Interestingly, this has affected both Dominican and Jewish thinkers, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From the Dominican side, the evidence of interaction with Jews, even if it occasionally resulted in violence, was symbolic to them of a coherent and effective Dominican mission ad extra, or outside the Christian community, from the order's very foundation. For many Jewish commentators, the same scattered events telescope themselves into a relentless march toward the Holocaust. Both of these approaches are asking too much of the evidence that we have, one that tends to result in a lack of concrete embeddedness in historical reality. The period from the 1950s to the 1970s showed exceptional efforts on both sides to discover, edit, and publish as much of the relevant sources as possible, though an astonishing amount of social and cultural history remains to be done. These efforts crystallized in 1982 with the publication of Jeremy Cohen's The Friars and the Jews. This exceptionally productive historian, trained by Brian Tierney at Cornell, today teaches at Tel Aviv University. It was his book that really set the terms of the debate for the next 40 years. In essence, his theory is that the Dominicans represent a decisive break in the history of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jews. According to Cohen, it was under their watch in the 13th century that the Church abandoned the venerable Augustinian witness doctrine. This teaching of St. Augustine, with which you are no doubt familiar, argues that Jews ought to be tolerated in Christian society because their existence offers a witness to the truth of the Hebrew Testament and Christian claims about it, while establishing that Christianity has deep historical and theological roots. Critically, it also asserts that Jews must not be compelled to convert because of the presumed reconciliation of all Israel at the end of days, as described in chapter 11 of Paul's letter to the Romans. Cohen argues that the friars, especially the Dominicans, threw Augustine's doctrine over in favor of one that began to treat rabbinical Judaism as a heresy. If such a claim were true, it meant that, unlike the biblical Judaism sanctioned by Augustine, such a novel interpretation of Judaism could be extirpated from Christian society. Such a strong claim was in line with R.I. Moore's ubiquitous contention that central medieval Christianity was a persecuting society that relentlessly oppressed the other in a vain attempt to undergird its own power and authority. A rising number of scholars in the ensuing decades after Moore and Cohen's important work have increasingly come to question these assertions, a tradition which will continue in this talk. I would like to examine some of these issues with a more contextual and non-teleological approach, but which also frames them in a broader philosophical and theological lens. I'd like to define a little bit more clearly some of the terms that I'm going to be using. In the first place, I'll refer to medieval inquisitions. Please notice the plural. There was no all-powerful centralized medieval inquisition. Such centralization would have to wait until 1478 in Spain. These inquisitions were processes of evidence discovery derived from Justinian's civil law that could cover a variety of criminal and civil cases. I will specifically be referring to heresy inquisitions in order to distinguish them from all other types. Various ad hoc heresy inquisitions had existed since 1184 and were only entrusted to the mendicant orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans, in the 1230s. These remained sporadic and localized until a certain professionalization came about as a result of the murder of St. Peter of Verona in 1252. So when I speak of Dominican heresy inquisitions before that year, one should think not of some well-oiled machinery of repression, but rather local initiatives headed by friars, which mostly involved preaching and disputation. Indeed, far more than formal inquisitional procedure, what we see mostly is disputation, which was one of the fundamental medieval forms both of intellectual life and of medieval entertainment. Remember, this was somewhat before the internet. Heresy inquisitions dealt with just that, heresy. In a technical, canonical sense, heresy can only be committed by a baptized Christian. Neither the Church nor the Inquisition ever claimed authority over the non-baptized. That is, the Inquisition had no authority over a Jew in terms of his Jewishness. Now, there were tangential matters that could involve a non-Christian in inquisitorial proceedings, such as public blasphemy or aiding Christian apostates. But in most cases, the Inquisitions had nothing whatsoever to do with the internal governance of non-Christian minorities. This is one aspect that makes Cohen's thesis untenable. Even if, by some stretch of the imagination, medieval rabbinical Jews were Jewish heretics, that still did not bring them under the authority of the Inquisition, and was, as was agreed by all, an internal Jewish affair. A deeper theoretical issue is that the premise of both Moore and Cohen is based on their contention that the central motivator for all human activity is the attainment and consolidation of power. From this perspective, any act, but particularly any act done by a dominant group, is reducible to power relations alone. While it is certainly true that power relations are a fundamental characteristic of human interaction, this does not mean that they are the only lens through which to assess motivation. Indeed, power as such has the characteristic of a means, not a final end or a purpose. Power is for something. Power is directed towards some other end. There are many other things which may and do motivate people. Wealth, pleasure, or, in a more positive sense, the chesed of classical Judaism, covenant love or faithfulness, or the caritas of Christianity, which is self-sacrificial love. To reduce the sacrifices of both Jews and Christians in their various sufferings and acts of martyrdom, to reduce that to naked power is not only a historical disservice, but dishonors the very persons we seek to study. Balanced against chesed and charity must be set Yetzer Hara. And it's analogous, not exactly, but analogous concept in Christianity, original sin. These lead to the negation of loving kindness in chet, or sinful behavior. In this richer model, the morality of power is determined by the degree to which it either corresponds to charity or it corresponds to sinfulness. And whether or not one accepts the reality of such distinctions as sin versus charity, at the very least, this was the lens through which medieval people, both Christians and Jews, understood their actions and motivations. And therefore it is incumbent upon us not to impose our modern categories and theories in the quest to understand what exactly was going on in the far-off 13th century. Indeed, I might even suggest that this model of charity versus sinfulness binds medieval Jews and Christians more closely together than it connects either with our modern outlook. With this in mind, let's look at some historical examples to outline the relations between the friars and the Jews of that time. From Moses to Moses, none arose like Moses. It is not going too far to say that Maimonides was the most influential Jewish person of the Middle Ages. His significance extended far beyond his own Jewish context, and he found interlocutors in both the Islamic and Christian worlds. Indeed, his introduction to the West, along with the Muslim philosophers Averroes and Avicenna, stimulated the astonishing achievements of the high scholastic period. Not only is he one of the most fundamentally important scripture scholars within Judaism, his Guide to the Perplexed was translated into Latin almost immediately after its translation into Hebrew. It became a fixed star for the incorporation of Aristotle into the Western world. Yet he was not without controversy. Indeed, his introduction, the introduction of his philosophical ideas into the European Jewish world, sent off shockwaves, dividing rabbi against rabbi, congregation against congregation. Though much historical work has been done on this controversy, we are at a disadvantage in that most of the remaining source material comes from pro-Maimonidean forces. Cohen has done an admirable job of dissecting the internal Jewish debate at the time. It seems the crux of opposition to what was seen as his excessive rationalism came from Rabbi Solomon ben Abraham of Montpellier, France. By the 1230s, in spite of Solomon's best efforts, the tide had significantly turned in favor of Rabbi Moses. It appears that, chagrined by the attitude of his co-religionists, he went to the Christian authorities, notably the papal delegate Cardinal Romanus, who referred the matter to the Franciscans and the Dominicans, friars who were then only in the beginning stages of developing processes for the Inquisition. Now, for this, Solomon was roundly vilified among his fellow Jews. He had handed over such a matter to the Gentiles. According to later Jewish sources, Maimonides' works were then burned by the Inquisition in 1233. There are serious historical problems with this story, ably detailed by Josef Schwartz in 2019. The sources, all coming from pro-Maimonidean forces, focus their anger at Solomon primarily, while getting a few digs at the Dominicans. Two French rabbis called them, quote, the gibbering and squeaking preachers, or the preaching prostitutes. I like that one particularly. These late sources also seem to conflate this event with the historical burning of the Talmud in 1242. Most especially, however, there is no documentation among the letters of Cardinal Romano, nor the Inquisition, which was known for its exceptional record keeping. Of course, this may simply be a case of missing documents, but what emerges is that no negative mark seems to have been attached by the Church to the writings of Maimonides. No later Christian sources ever refer to such an event, even when they engaged in anti-Jewish polemic. And indeed, by the 1240s, much of Maimonides' writings had been translated into Latin and were being eagerly consumed by the scholastic thinkers who appropriated him into their works. Indeed, it may very well have been the case that Rabbi Solomon, intending to denounce Maimonides, actually introduced him to the Christian world, where he began to acquire such a reputation that no less a figure than Thomas Aquinas cites him repeatedly with the honorific title of the Rabbi. Yet this did not mean that there was not trouble ahead. Christians began to be curious about and to investigate Jewish writings more extensively. Of course, this was not only dispassionate philosophical searching, was sometimes motivated by religious hatred. An example of this was the Jewish apostate Nicholas Donin, who was excommunicated from Judaism in 1225. By 1235, he had converted to Christianity and had become a Franciscan. Nicholas was a man with a grudge. He decided to attack his former co-religionists from the perspective of the Talmud, translating offensive passages into Latin and presenting them to the Pope for a decision. Indeed, though beyond the topic of this talk, it has been proposed that Nicholas was a Karaite Jew who rejected post-biblical interpretation, which would somewhat explain his hatred for the Talmud. Pope Gregory IX and many Christian thinkers were shocked at some of the contents Nicholas revealed. This demonstrates how unfamiliar they were with the rabbinical traditions affirmed by the Talmud. Christians for centuries had conceived of an idealized Jew, one who, having rejected Christ, continued to follow the law as set down in Torah. Medieval Christianity seemed blindsided by the existence of a continuing rabbinical tradition that guided the lives of the Jewish communities in their midst. They had never conceived of an oral Torah, passed down through generations of interpreters, much less one that would cast aspersions on Christian belief. To comprehend the events that took place next, one should understand the gravity of blasphemy in pre-modern history. It was considered to be one of the worst crimes, punishable by public authorities not only because of its content, but because of the very real possibility of religious violence. Indeed, such laws are no ancient relic. The blasphemy statute was not struck down in Great Britain until 2008. And even today, under the cover of religious toleration, such laws are coming back into vogue in terms of restrictions on free speech. In light of the blasphemous passages adduced by Nicholas, Christendom underwent a reflexive spasm against contemporary Judaism, starting from Pope Gregory's decision to ban the Talmud in 1239, to its burning in Paris in 1242, to its condemnation by Christian scholars in 1248. Donin had achieved his revenge, and it ushered in a new period of Jewish-Christian relations. Though Donin was a Franciscan, the Dominicans were active as well. Their primary focus was Christian heresy, approached from a more intellectual standpoint. Dominic, though he longed for an evangelical ministry in pagan countries, found himself much more directed towards internal missions to heretics. Indeed, he was known as cordial to all people, with the exception of the heretical Cathars. As Brother John of Spain attested in 1233, quote, Dominic used to show himself as loving to all, the rich, the poor, the Jews and the Gentiles, of whom there were many in Spain, and he was loved by all, except heretics. Some of the earliest intellectual works of the order are anti-heretical summas from the 1240s by such figures as Moneta of Cremona, Rainario Sacconi, and St. Peter of Verona. These efforts were primarily directed against the heresy of Catharism, a dualist sect that believed in two gods, one good who created the spiritual world, and one evil who had created all material reality. It was profoundly opposed not only to the Catholic doctrine of the Incarnation, but was set against the fundamental teachings of Genesis chapters 1 to 3. Some of the most unbelievable charges adduced against the Jews in the Middle Ages, though these were very few, were that Cathars and Jews colluded with one another. There could be no greater religious gulf than between the Cathars and the Jewish people, since they were solidly monotheistic and united in defense of the goodness of material creation, while these neo-Gnostic dualists derided material reality. In these anti-heretical summas, there is no attack on the Jews whatsoever. What one does discover is an extended defense of the Old Testament and of the creation of all material reality by the God of the Old Testament, whom the Cathars considered to be Satan. We also find examples of the old literary form called church versus synagogue, in which Christians debated imaginary Jewish interlocutors at the time of Christ, evincing little care for and interest in contemporary issues. So at least during the first generation, then, there was no particularly defined Dominican mission externally. The focus was rather on the recalling of lost Christian sheep to the fold. Now, one possible objection to the issue of Dominican mission in the first generation is the character of Saint Raymond of Peñafort. There is perhaps no Dominican so vilified in Jewish scholarly literature than this Aragonese friar and legal scholar. This is largely for two reasons. In the first place, a handful of Dominicans who later engaged in anti-Jewish activity were, for short periods of time, students at language schools that he patronized. Such a tenuous connection has been called by some, quote, the secret anti-Jewish cabal of Raymond of Peñafort. Secondly, the first comprehensive biographies about him come only in the mid-1300s, almost a century after he died, and during which a new and more sinister version or vision of Christian and Jewish relations was coming to dominate. In that context, his biographer was keen to foreground stories of Raymond's missionary prowess against Jews and Muslims, some of which are historically impossible. In the last 20 years, however, Raymond has begun to see a reassessment. He was above all a legal scholar, an intellectual, and an administrator, fully dedicated to the Dominican mission of salvation of souls. Born in 1175, he was a late vocation to the Dominican order, joining it when he was almost 50 years old in the 1220s. Already an accomplished law professor, he was invited to the Roman court by Pope Gregory IX. There he served as personal confessor and major penitentiary from 1230 to 1238. While there, he wrote a famous treatise on confession that mentioned nothing about the Jews, except that they were rigidly to be distinguished from Christian heretics, and makes the significant qualification accepted by all later Dominicans that heretics sinned far worse than did Jews or Gentiles. He also compiled the great legal collection known as the Decretals, which became normative canon law for Catholics until 1917. It is true that this collection compiled numerous anti-Jewish laws enacted through the centuries, mostly having to do with religious segregation. Several of these documents contained significant anti-Jewish vitriol. Yet, at the same time, Raymond included texts from St. Augustine and St. Gregory that pled for toleration. He even included the papal bull Sicut Judaeis, which was issued at the beginning of each papal reign calling for toleration of the Jews. What it boils down to is that Raymond was not really the author of this collection, but was a professional compiler who included both pro and anti-Jewish legislation. He added nothing of his own opinions to this compilation. What the Decretals did establish was a legal basis for tolerance in the midst of religious separation. Now, this is not the negative tolerance that grew in the Enlightenment, which can effectively be reduced to the Voltairean concept of peace through indifference. It was rather, as Istvan Bekci stated, medieval tolerance that looked not to the implied evil of the act, for evil acts always remained evil, but rather to the prudence of addressing evil given the possibility that greater evils could follow. It is a practical realization of the sinfulness of people measured against the requirements of common political and social life. By the time Nicolas Donin had arrived at the Curia, Raymond had already moved on, taking charge of the Dominican order for 3 years and accomplishing much for them. Now 65 years old, Raymond moved back to Barcelona, where he became a moderate and trusted advisor to King Jaime, tempering the activity of the Inquisition in the Kingdom of Aragon. While there, he was very much in a pluralistic culture, both social and religious, in terms of both social and religious forms, and he began to see the opportunities made possible in terms of language study. Up until the 1240s, the Dominicans had not spent much time learning different languages, resting content in the highly developed idiom of the schools, Latin. That was going to begin to change, both for practical and for theological reasons. During that decade, there was a push from the friars to get their students to learn Arabic and Hebrew. This was partially to access the astonishing amount of text then pouring in from Islamic Spain. As the Muslim world began to turn its back on philosophy and on rational theology, texts and philosophers made their way to Spain, the last outpost of the Islamic Golden Age. Ironically, it would be the intellectual life of Christendom which would be the greatest beneficiary of the wisdom of both Muslims and Jews living in Islamic lands. Therefore, the first priority was training translators to convey this treasure into Latin. Secondly, there was a rising interest in access to Hebrew texts. The discovery of the Talmud had come as a shock, but prescient scholars saw the advantages of learning Hebrew in an academic setting in order to access the interpretive tradition of the rabbis. Maximalist scholars, among both Dominicans and Jews, have seen these language schools as directed primarily to conversion. However, Robin Vos, with close historical analysis, has since demonstrated that they were, quote, temporary and relatively informal programs for the edification of a small intellectual elite, end quote. After all, there would be no need to learn either Hebrew or Arabic to preach among local non-Christians, since all of them spoke in their respective vernaculars. There were never more than a handful of friars in attendance at any one time, and throughout the 13th century, the continued survival of such language schools was on a tenuous basis. Perhaps more interesting is the fact that in Aragon, at least, provisions were made to hire Jewish teachers to train the friars in Hebrew. This fact indicates, if not a harmonious, then at least a quotidian exchange between the two communities. Had these schools been directed against the heart of the Jewish faith, I doubt that Jews would have had any interest in teaching there at all. Indeed, it's been proposed by Edmund Matza in his fascinating new book, The Scholastics and the Jews, that Raymond Peñafort saw the short-sightedness of Donin's approach to rabbinical Judaism, and perhaps swayed the papacy to an almost complete about-face in 1247. Though the next pope, Innocent IV, had at first been disposed against the Talmud, he had become convinced both by Jews and by Christian scholars that the Talmud was indeed essential to the practice of contemporary Judaism, and permitted it to be returned to Jewish communities after the 24 or so offensive passages had been expurgated. As a side note, censorship and expurgation were a common tool used by the Church for numerous works, mostly Christian ones, up until about the year 1600. If anything, instead of considering medieval rabbinical Judaism as heretical, Raymond introduced the idea that the Talmud itself could be useful in religious dispute. and encouraged its study by Christians. Even if later Dominicans denounced the Talmud, it was still within the Raimundian context of its utility and relation to historic Judaism, rather than from Donin's blanket condemnation of the text. The final charge against Raymond regards his activity at the Barcelona disputation of 1263. Here we see another converted Jew, Paul Cristiani, having become a Dominican, who engineered a debate with the famous Rabbi Nachmanides. Several things are notable in regard to this debate. First of all, it was just that, a real disputation. It is difficult to overestimate the popularity or importance of the disputation format in the 13th century. It was the centerpiece of scholasticism, in which highly trained scholars and debaters would match wits both for the entertainment and the edification of eager attendees. Indeed, this was one of the most popular forms of entertainment during the century. Not only were there academic disputes, there were also interreligious disputes. Many inquisitorial investigations before 1252 took place in the context of public debate. And the Talmud debates of 1242 and 1263 were no different. They were attended not only by the king, clergy, and nobility, but by common people, and at least in a few narrative sources by the Jewish community itself. It was not engineered with a foreordained outcome. Though Christianity set the terms of the debate, the rest was wide open. Indeed, the only record we have of Raymond of Peñafort at the debate is his giving Nachmanides permission to speak with perfect freedom on any issue, as long as he avoided items deemed blasphemous to Christians. It's the only record we have of Raymond at this debate. There were no threats of confiscations. There were no threats of burnings of texts. Indeed, though each side later made protestations of victory, their accounts overlap enough to draw out a picture of a sincere and sustained intellectual dialogue. Perhaps most fundamentally of all, Christianity, instead of attacking the Talmud as Donin did, rather used the Talmud in order to try to prove the messiahship of Jesus and the truth of Christianity. Based on these facts, Robert Chazan refutes Cohen's view that this indicated a wholesale replacement of Augustinian witness doctrine with a sinister new Dominican plan for the expulsion of Judaism. Though it is clear that Paul Cristiani was anti-Jewish, and that he had convinced the extremely anti-Jewish Pope, Clement IV, to further his mission against the Jews, one cannot lay the blame on Raymond Peñafort individually or the culture of Aragon generally. One should remember that Raymond was likely near 90 years old at the time of the debate. Further, we are fortunate that we have studies that have done excellent archival work in the Kingdom of Aragon, both by David Nirenberg and Robin Vos. These have helped to establish both the cadence of daily life in the kingdom and the unusual nature of such events as the 1263 disputation. Nirenberg's work shows how ritualized violence contributed to social peace. For example, the toleration of young clerics throwing stones at the gates of the Jewish quarter on Good Friday. Nirenberg argues such controlled outbursts acted as relief valves for otherwise volatile situations. Further, he reminds us that it was not only the Christians who policed boundaries, be they topographical, economic, or sexual. All distinct groups acted similarly. Christians, Jews, and Muslims shared a commitment to maintaining their distinctiveness, and such boundary policing was occasionally even cooperative, limiting, for example, the unstructured mixing of adolescents from different religious backgrounds, fertile ground for conversions. Vos, for his part, chooses to focus on the everyday life of Jews and Christians, using the rich archival records of medieval Aragon. In the first place, he stresses the Iberian Peninsula was not a focus of the medieval Dominican order. It had few convents, and these were often poorly staffed. Rather, the order focused on an axis that ran from Rome to Bologna, then to Paris, then to Oxford. Areas outside that were marginal to 13th century Dominican life. Indeed, brilliant friars from Iberia had to go outside of their provinces until the establishment of Dominican universities in the 14th century. Further than that, the catalogs of medieval Dominican libraries in Spain show that there were almost no Arabic or Hebrew texts possessed by the convents themselves. This makes the great anti-Jewish Dominican work of the late 13th century by Raymond Martí so singular and exceptional. Called the Pugio Fidei, or the Dagger of the Faith, the author proceeded to marshal nearly 1,000 pages of religious controversy with contemporary Judaism. This is no rehash of tired anti-Jewish stereotypes. Living in close proximity to large Jewish communities, men like Ramon, and I want to distinguish this is different from Raymond of Peñafort, so I use his Aragonese name. Men like Ramon were forced to come up with new and innovative arguments. We are a long way from when Christendom was surprised at the contents of the Talmud. Raymond shows not only intimate knowledge of the text, but carefully includes whole passages in Hebrew, which are then transliterated into Latin characters before being accurately translated. He is thoroughly immersed in Jewish literature, including the rabbinic Aggadah and Halakha. Two things are apparent from this work. In the first place, we have entered a new stage in religious polemic. Instead of tilting at imagined biblical Jews or trotting out tired old prejudices, we now see the professionalization of controversy. Men skilled in languages who take Jewish texts seriously, and because they do so, believe they can refute Judaism from them. The second fact is that Ramon's work had almost no effect. It was rarely copied in the Middle Ages, and when it was without the careful Hebrew language work. We possess only one complete manuscript copy. It only survived at all because of an early modern printed edition. No Aragonese convents reported even having a copy. It did not make its way into Dominican library collections, much less into the broader world. It was a brilliant, virulent, intellectual dead end. As a counterpoint to Raymond's vitriol, we're confronted with the everyday character of life in the Kingdom of Aragon. Dominican friars regularly employed the services of Jewish doctors. They lived and worked side by side in a life of day-to-day existence. 5 years after the confrontation about the Talmud in 1263, the Dominicans of Barcelona, whose convent abutted the Jewish quarter, were asked about whether they would mind if the Jews constructed a new synagogue near them. Not only were there no protests, but the friars there asserted they had never had any trouble, nor were they ever bothered by the synagogue services of their neighbors. Indeed, far from 1263 being some beginning of the end, we rather find that in 1997, Yom Tov Assis was able to publish a book entitled, quote, The Golden Age of Aragonese Jewry, 1213 to 1327. Yet, if we cannot precisely fix a date for a definitive souring of Jewish-Christian relations, perhaps some clues can be found in the intellectual centers of Dominican life. At the University of Paris, St. Albert the Great, patron of natural scientists, added his name to 40 other scholars who condemned the Talmud in 1248. Yet, careful work by Alexander Fedora has shown that later in his career, Albert made accurate, if not extensive, use of Talmudic material. This is perhaps more significant because Albert was the main teacher of Thomas Aquinas, the man whose theology would come to shape and define Catholicism over the next 700 years. When examining Thomas's approach to Judaism, one thing becomes clear. The courtesy and kindness which he extended to all his intellectual adversaries was not lacking where the Jews were concerned. There is good reason why Cohen focused on Raymond of Peñafort and not Thomas as the locus of significant change towards the Jewish community. Thomas, for his part, never compiled any primarily anti-Jewish texts. Even assertions that Raymond of Peñafort got Thomas to write the Summa contra Gentiles against the Jews and Muslims is likely apocryphal. Recent scholarship has demonstrated that massive text was designed as a refutation of radical Aristotelians and Averroes at the University of Paris. For a long time, scholars have also known that the little treatise called the Letter to Margaret of Flanders, sometimes called the Letter on Treatment of the Jews, is an occasional piece that Thomas hastily fired off late in his life. In a hurried manner, he deals with the issues of interreligious financial transactions. As most scholars have realized, this piece is more about an Aristotelian theory of usury rather than any comprehensive statement on the position of the Jewish people. More instructive is Thomas's personal behavior, in an event that was reflective of his character. Once he was invited to spend the winter holidays at the castle of Molar as a guest of Cardinal Richard of Sant'Angelo. Also invited were two of the cardinal's friends, a Jewish father and son, rich men from Rome, who were accustomed also to spending the winter holiday with Richard. For 2 days, Thomas patiently and charitably discussed questions of faith with them. On the first day, he appeared to have answered all the questions that they had, but he said essentially to them, "Sleep on it. Meet him back in the morning," when they resumed their friendly chat. This episode, told by an eyewitness, is an example not only of Thomas's personal charity, but of the possibilities of social interaction that were possible even in the midst of religious difference. The classic study on Thomas's approach is John Hood's Aquinas and the Jews, in which Hood usefully situates the Dominican's teaching in its context, though he focuses almost exclusively on the Summa Theologia, admittedly one of the most important works in the Catholic tradition. In this work, one does not discover sustained meditation on the Jewish people, but rather scattered indications of his approach to them. One section discusses the guilt of the Jews vis-à-vis the death of Jesus. Thomas, as was his habit, made a distinction. The ones who bore guilt were the Jewish leaders at the time of Christ, and even these did not act with full knowledge. Thomas absolves the majority of first-century Jews from any guilt whatsoever, and by extension, the Jews of all subsequent centuries. It is surprising that Cohen treats this as a dark innovation, when in reality it effectively dispels the collective charge of deicide against the Jewish people. Thomas, like his Dominican confreres, also takes the reality and goodness of the Old Testament with utmost seriousness. Indeed, Thomas's analysis of the Torah tends to follow Maimonides rather than the Christian fathers of the Church. He realizes there is a deeper meaning behind the literal observance of the law. Martin Jaffe has underscored how Thomas has learned political prudence from Maimonides. When Thomas declares the continued observance of the ceremonial law of the Jews is a mortal sin, he later clarifies it is a mortal sin for Christians, opening up a space for the continued toleration of Jewish rights within Christian communities by those who were never baptized. While Thomas considers the relation between the Old and the New Law as the relation between imperfect to perfect, he places both in the same species of God-given law. Thomas, being a good Aristotelian, is also very strong on the question of natural justice. Because of their human nature, created in the image and likeness of God, Jews could not be forced to convert. Belief is a free act, and this extended to the natural rights of parents to raise their children. For this reason, he argued it was gravely immoral to remove Jewish children from their parents and to baptize them against their wishes. In the end, though, Hood was pessimistic. He thought Thomas merely rehashed older points of view that tended towards the more tolerant, meaning that his conservative attitude was out of sync with the rising pressures of popular prejudice around him. But I want to challenge that point. In the first place, Thomas was innovative in his treatment of the Old Law, going so far as to emphasize Rabbi Moses over the Church Fathers. His strong assertion of the natural law and natural justice was a needed antidote to the voluntaristic tendencies of the Augustinian tradition, which occasionally threatened to overcome nature with grace. Most importantly, though, Hood underplayed a critical text for understanding Thomas's thought on the Jewish people, and this was his extended treatment of Romans chapters 9 to 11 in his biblical commentary. In these chapters of Paul's epistle to the Romans, we see the first century apostle his extended analysis of the theological and eschatological roles of the Jewish people in the providence of God. We are fortunate that an illuminating study appeared in 2008 about this work by Stephen Boguslavsky. He suggests that when most people think of the Augustinian witness doctrine, too much is focused on its apologetical content, that the continued existence of the Jews testifies to the historical continuity of Christianity. Instead, more focus needs to be placed on the corporate predestination of the Jewish people, as enunciated in Romans. This is exactly what Thomas accomplishes in his commentary. Thomas consistently asserts that, quote, the very name of Jew is an honorable one, and on several occasions cites John 4:22, salvation is from the Jews. Thomas's primary concern is affirming Paul's position that the Jews have an ongoing role to play in salvation history, that there is no question of simple supersession. Like Paul, Thomas insists on the numerous prerogatives enjoyed by the Jews, the lineal descent from Abraham, the promises, the law, the divinely ordained worship. These prerogatives are a result of divine predestination and cannot be revoked. Just as God's election of Israel cannot cease, its corporate predestination cannot be denied. Boguslavsky suggests that an excessive emphasis on individual predestination and justification, produced as a result of the Protestant Reformation, has clouded our concepts of corporate salvation, which is so present within the Hebrew Scriptures. The fidelity of God to his promises does not necessarily entail the salvation of each individual member of the Hebrew people, just as it does not mean the salvation of any particular Gentile. However, as God has repeatedly done in Scripture, he has preserved a remnant of Israel for himself. It is for this reason, not merely apologetical, prudential, or political, that Jews must be tolerated within the context of a Christian community, for they are the living signs of the predestination of God himself and his faithfulness towards his covenantal promises. This is no restatement of the witness doctrine, but a powerful new argument that I would say has been recognized even by the modern Catholic Church in its relations to the Jewish people. So what then can we say as to the final analysis on the relations between the Dominicans and the Jews? This lecture has sought to contextualize and more fully to characterize Dominican acts and writings to suggest several things. First, there was no architectonic mission of the Dominican order for the conversion of non-Christians in general, or the Jews in particular. The mission of the order was fundamentally directed towards the spiritual direction and protection of the Christian people. One aspect of this was polemic and inquisition against Christian heretics. Pace Cohen, there is no support for the idea that Dominicans turned medieval rabbinical Judaism into a heresy that was thereby subject to persecution by the Church. Third, it has sought to, in some manner, rehabilitate St. Raymond of Peñafort from unhistorical slurs against him, and to propose that Thomas Aquinas, far from parroting patristic sentiments on the Jewish people, was in actuality deeply innovative. Yet, this is not all. We must still account for the rising cycle of persecution and violence that periodically broke out against the Jews in this age. And I do want to stress the word periodically. As Bose and Nirenberg make clear, for every disputation against the Talmud, there were thousands of days of peaceful, if not necessarily friendly, coexistence. Yet, as we approach the year 1300, such persecutional events do become more common. The prejudiced violence of many of the common people in the Middle Ages came too often to be overlooked, or in some cases actively supported. Prejudice began to overwhelm reason and theological conviction, especially as crises began to rock the late medieval period in the 14th century. The Dominicans were not insulated from this, and individual friars were certainly guilty of advancing such irrational and monstrous activities. It should challenge the Christian and the historian that some Dominicans could, in 1255, heroically defend the Jewish community in Lincoln, England, against blood libel, at great financial cost to themselves. And yet, in 1288, other friars colluded in the execution of 13 Jews in Troyes, France, who had been framed for a ritual murder. While the Inquisition had no formal authority over the Jews as Jews, they had, by the end of the 13th century, acquired competence over cases of blasphemy and charges of abetting or helping apostates. These new powers would be used to harass Jewish communities wherever the Inquisitions were active. The acceleration of such harassment in the 14th and 15th centuries, including the expulsions and the endurance of the blood libel myths, leaves one wondering where the moderating ideas of canonists like Raymond and theologians like Thomas went. Many explanations have been offered. Those who propose a history rooted in power relations only see the exaltation of domination. Fresh off the Gregorian reforms and victory over the German emperors, the popes and their mendicant adjuncts began to make universalizing dreams a reality, imposing discipline and oversight with impunity. But this view fails to take into account the real limitations of papal and inquisitorial power in the Middle Ages. Nothing could be further from the truth, as Mazza puts it, as medieval Christendom as a fascist police state, with the mendicants as stormtroopers. A Marxist account suggests that since the mendicants were drawn from the rising middle class, they brought their class prejudices with them, which included hatred of usurers, usually identified with the Jew. This interpretation fails to take into account the effects of Aristotelian monetary theory, which it seems the mendicants were far more eager to defend rather than to attack the Jews as such. Indeed, it also fails to account for the fact that it was the mendicant theologians, by the end of the Middle Ages, who had articulated new theories of money, credit, and interest that would prove to be the foundations of the modern capitalist world. Cohen provides a further suggestion that Christians had developed a new sense of pride and hatred of otherness that led to a rising nativism, a desire to circle the wagons. It was therefore a psychology of fear that drove increasing attacks. This view may have some validity. However, one needs to balance it against the exceptional pluralism of Christendom, where men and women of different languages and cultures met and spoke freely, challenged and disputed with one another, and eagerly traveled and traded, producing an internationalism that would not be approached again until the age of globalization. While many of these approaches offer us glimpses of reality, I think we need to go deeper. One promising avenue that has been suggested is a rising tide of apocalypticism, a phenomenon that is always present wherever Christianity is found. Especially when paired with popular prejudice, it can be an explosive combination that can lead to fanatical excesses. In this sense, a debased, popularizing interpretation of the Pauline idea that the conversion of the Jews would precede the final judgment, rather on several occasions turned into lamentable episodes of forced conversions and even pogroms. Such excesses were always deplored by the Church and the Dominicans at large, but nevertheless they occurred. We must also not discount corruption in the Church, which damaged the kind of witness she was able to give in times of crisis. In addition, ancient stereotypes, born in the earliest ages of Christianity, certainly added to the tinder, as they did from the Jewish side in terms of the ostensibly blasphemous passages from the Talmud. I would also make the argument that the triumph of philosophical nominalism in the 14th century had deleterious effects. Nominalism is the idea that there are no universal realities that things share in common. The only things that really exist are individuals. It is a rejection not only of Platonism, but also of Thomistic Aristotelianism. For example, in nominalism there is nothing underlying the concept human. There is no real human nature that you and I share together, but only individuals joined together by the convenience of a verbal term. If there is no human nature, then there is nothing preventing me from arbitrarily dividing people into divergent and opposed groups, or even redefining the word human altogether. I do not think it is a coincidence that we see the first purity of blood laws in Spain from 1449, and the rise of a discernible racial anti-Semitism in the 16th century. For in the absence of a common human nature, an idea championed by Greek and Jew and Christian alike, only then does racism become possible. Yet, at least from the Christian side, there is an even deeper tragedy. We can see in these episodes failures on a number of levels. Failures of church officials effectively to deal with such events. Failures of the Dominican order effectively to head off fanaticism in its own ranks. A disconnect between intellectual and dogmatic convictions and realities on the ground. Yet the tragic events that transpired at different times and places in the Middle Ages represent a far deeper existential failure on the part of Christians, a failure of charity. Where Jews were tolerated, where their theological relevance was reinforced, where their rights were defended, there was Christian charity. There was a recognition of their sacramentality, as Edmund Matza puts it, of their genuine humanity, their bearing of the image and likeness of God, in anticipation of Thomas's 16th century disciples who would articulate and defend the concept of universal human rights. In those places, the commonality of our sinful human condition and the possibility of redemption was realized. As Rabbi Yosef Schweitzer said at the beatification of Sarah Salakaji, who was killed for saving Jews, he said, quote, "Originating in her faith, she kept the commandment of love until death," end quote. Yet wherever Jews were compelled to baptism, beaten, expelled, or killed, there was the failure of charity, the profoundest failure that Christians can experience. There, in short, was sin. In such places, the teaching of Jesus and of the church was emphatically not enacted. What instead was enacted by individuals was moral evil. In the end, and as difficult as it is to understand given modern categories, the Dominican mission, when not marred by willful acts of evil, was dedicated to love. In working to save souls, to share the good, to tolerate sinful people, all of these were involved for the medieval Dominicans in love of one's neighbor. To fail in understanding this is to fail to understand the period entirely. Köszönöm meg egyszer, Todalachshov.
Thank you for your lecture, Professor Prudlow. I think we learned a lot. I think the title promised us more about the great picture about the medieval Europe. It was very interesting, the case study in Aragonia. But this is the time to ask, to comment. He is a very good, brilliant professor from Tulsa.
There were many brilliant professors that made this possible, so I don't want to...
So, please, Attila.
What is the attitude of Dominican order today concerning the ancient history, about the attitude to the Jew?
Very much like the whole Catholic Church, there's been undergoing a historical purification of memory. There have been events for the Inquisition, for anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, where they've studied these things, and where they have truly been at fault, they have made apologies for these things as well. So it's coming to the historical facts, and then to a realization of guilt in that sense.
Next question.
Just a remark, we have invited the Dominican order here, the representatives from Hungary, but unfortunately...
Oh well, they can, that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you though, that was a good idea.
Yeah.
Comments, questions, Russ?
Are you arguing, as other scholars have, that Thomas Aquinas developed a double covenant theology
I don't think I'd go that far. I think he wouldn't put it in that way. The covenant is one that is going. It's one ongoing covenant, but not in a supersessionist sense. That the Jews continue to be part of this covenant because of the predestination of God that will be manifested by God at the end of time together. So I wouldn't call it a double
So
covenant.
he's not abandoning supersession.
Well, see, you're making it either or. I think that what Boguslavsky is arguing is that it's more complicated than that. That to say a supersessionism is to say that almost to say the election of the Jewish people is over, and that there is a new Israel, the church. Whereas the double covenant would say that God has two separate tracks of salvation, which I don't think Thomas would say at all. Thomas is very clear on the uniqueness of salvation through Christ. And so in some way that covenant has to be one, and that the covenant of the Jews is not revoked at the same time.
One more question, comment, footnote, or protest?
You can protest too. That's
Protest.
fine. Or insights.
Is there anything you won't blame on nominalism?
Now, there's
I'm
very
just
little
kidding.
I won't blame on nominalism. I think that's pretty much the whole source of it all. I mean, if I have no possibility for human nature, I mean, if there's nothing concrete that connects us together as human persons, then racism becomes a possibility all of a sudden.
I agree with you. I'm just giving you the business.
I get it.
Another. Did you go ahead? I read it.
Just consider the cases of blood libel cases in the 20th century, and you compare them.
Well, I mean, for instance, where in
Well, there were some cases in Bohemia, Russia.
in the 20th century.
20th century.
Wow.
or
No, this. I mean,
19th century.
I mean, these ideas are born out of popular prejudice and they continue underground for so long. I wonder if anyone's done a comparative study between blood libel, modern blood libel, and medieval blood libel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I don't know. That would be very interesting, though. I agree.
New issue, new plan.
Yeah, actually, new plan. I come here. I do a Fulbright here, but yes.
Yes.
I'll ask. Now I know that this is very difficult to calculate, but how much, or have you considered the prospect that Christian anti-Judaism might be, at least to a certain extent, a product of the fact that Christians are afraid that they might be wrong and the Jews might be right about Jesus?
Yes. No, I think there's certainly, and we see that in early Christianity in the patristic period. I mean, I think that's where a lot of the early anti-Jewish stereotypes come from. Which is why I said fear is a possible partial explanation for this. And I also want scholars to take seriously the idea that conversion is not just about power. When it's not being, forcibly, when somebody forcibly converts someone, that's not what I'm talking about. There were genuine conversions back and forth between Christianity and Judaism, and these were authentic conversions. Christians becoming convinced of the truth of Judaism and vice versa.
Has anybody written about that? Because you referred to apostate Christians, and I assumed you meant, heretical Christians, but I guess that there is a distinction between apostate.
We don't have a lot of stories. So
Okay.
there's huge amounts of data that the Inquisition kept on Christians on relapse. So that there's maybe 20 or 30 cases of Christians who had
converted to Christianity and returned to Judaism.
But however, we have very few records of Christians, and certainly there were a not insubstantial number who converted from Christianity to Judaism and just merged within the Jewish community. Right? Went through the Jewish purification rituals and simply disappeared. I mean, the Inquisition had very little power to try to find them or compel them. The Inquisition had very little power. I'm trying to illustrate how much that this is in the Middle Ages. They did not have a lot of.
But you point out when people think of the Inquisition, they think of the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
And You know,
Right.
even that recently scholars have rethought that,
Yeah,
entirely.
And that's, for the purification of historical memory, we need to have the accurate history. I mean, that's the key. We can have the purification, we can have the reconciliation, we can do that, but what we need to not be apologizing for things that didn't happen. All right, things and which is why historians is so important in this task of historical memory.
Okay. Anybody else?
Thank you, Tomasz. This was very nice to
Thank you. Thank you again.
Communication as well.
We learned a lot about the human nature, for example.
Okay. Hopefully it helps the work of the Holocaust Center here, and that's for a broader understanding. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it on an afternoon. After national holiday, before Purim, it's, you fit it in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.